My favorite hobby is fishing. Sometimes when I'm targeting a certain kind of fish and that fish happens to be more active at night, I have no problem staying out all night to catch them. Luckily, in my town, there aren't many places where you're prohibited to fish. In fact, there are popular fishing spots all around. So when I'm fishing alone, I don't get particularly worried or frightened, even at night. Every now and then, another angler will turn up to keep me company. I had been fishing in the same spots for years now, and I wanted a bit of a change. I wanted to find a new place, give me a bit of a thrill, discovering a new spot with the chances of catching something brand new. Walking around relying on my headlamp alone for light in the dark, it was peaceful until one night. I spent a couple of hours searching for a new place to fish online. I had worked that day until around 5 p.m. I had all my tackle and gear in my car already, so I was ready to just go straight after work ended. The night started to draw in as I headed for a new spot I'd discovered. The spot I'd found was a small embankment located right behind an abandoned factory. Because this factory had been abandoned for a number of years now, the building was quite dilapidated, and some parts of it were decaying and had collapsed already. Weeds grew high all around it. It was difficult to make my way through the grounds. It was hard to see where I was going. There were no street lights on in this area, obviously, so I had to rely on the use of my headlamp. As I groped through the weeds toward the embankment, I pushed through all the brush until suddenly it ended with a sharp drop-off into the water below. I nearly even fell in myself. I had reached my destination. I could see the embankment a little bit a ways. I found a gap in a fence nearby with a "Do Not Enter" sign that was covered in rust. The width of the gap must have been about a meter or so. I crept through and I could finally see the whole embankment in all its glory. It was then, for the first time though, that I saw a silhouette of something. A person. He looked like he had beige work clothes on and looked middle-aged, approaching elderly. He was sat on a blue cooler box with a rod in hand. It was a narrow spot, so I took the initiative. It's just manners, really, no matter where you are or why you're fishing. I decided to approach him and strike up some good small talk to let him know I was there. "Good evening, sir. How's it going?" He didn't react at all. Didn't move, didn't twitch a muscle. I was only about 50 meters away from him. I would have expected him to have heard me. I thought it was a bit strange he didn't respond at all. It wasn't like I'd mumbled or something. His silhouette was dark. I couldn't clearly see him. I felt a bit anxious for a moment, but I tried not to let it bother me too much. My purpose of going there was to fish, not make friends, so I didn't really care. I wasn't going to let that ruin my night. I started to fish, and I was concentrating. About an hour had passed by before I even realized. I was focused on my rod, watching the sea level, watching my lure. It was as if there was nothing else there but me and my hobby. It was in March, and it was in early spring that year. It was really warm even at night. I started to sweat all over. I couldn't stand the heat anymore. I went to take my life jacket off so I could take my shirt off. That was when I noticed something strange. The man had disappeared. Not just him, but his cooler box, his rug. There was just empty darkness left where he had been. He had disappeared. Did he fall into the water or something? I rushed to the edge and peered down with my headlamp's light, illuminating the dark water. There was no trace of the man. It wasn't even 10 o'clock, but a thick fog had rolled in suddenly. I sensed that something was kind of weird here. I began to panic. I started to sweat, and shivers crept up my mind. I heard strange gurgling noises coming from an area of water nearby. I couldn't bear to be there anymore. I ran as fast as I could and pushed my way through the weeds until I arrived back at my car. If I continued fishing like nothing had happened, the thick fog would have enveloped me. I might have easily lost my footing and fell into the water myself. In fact, I wondered if that's what happened to that man. When the thought occurred to me, I shuddered in my car. Since the incident, I quit going to strange places with no entry zones, especially at night. However good it sounds or whatever fish there might be, it might be a dangerous area if the conditions are right. I was working in a large assisted living facility for a few years. I absolutely loved my job. I worked with the elderly mostly, but I had become a highly requested assistant and got moved all around. The dementia ward, the short-term rehab ward, the stroke ward, all over the place. Being a people person, I really didn't mind. I liked going the extra mile in my job and getting to know my patients and their families on a more personal level. I felt like it made me a better CNA. It wasn't uncommon for me to be assigned to the more difficult patients because I could typically handle them without much problem. It was a regular day. My charge nurse had mentioned that we would be getting a few new admits, and I didn't think much of it. Everything went routinely, and we got them all settled into their rooms and stuff. One patient in particular was already being a handful and tried to escape a few times. We needed to move him to the secured unit. I could hear him yelling and cussing out everyone, telling them they were all idiots and that it was unnecessary to be doing all of this. A few of the nurses suggested I go and try and calm him down, so of course I said yes. I put on my most charming smile and waltzed on over, asking him what exactly was the problem. He immediately seemed to take a liking to me and calm down. He told me nobody there knew how to do their job, and he wanted some damn food already. I told him dinner would be served soon, and I'd make sure to bring his tray to him. He cooperated with everyone as long as I was around, took his meds, took a shower, settled into bed no problem. Once my shift was over though, he immediately started acting up again, and he ended up needing one-on-one supervision. Different staff members would take turns monitoring him, and eventually I had to as well. It was an easy day's work for me. Get him an ice cream here and there, watch some TV, I didn't really mind at all. He told me a bit about his life and asked about mine as well. Mostly if I liked what I do and how come I'd never worked in the security unit. I told him I usually had my own group of patients in the front I had to look after, but I'd make an effort to drop in and see him when I could. At first, the rest of the staff thought it was great. They would call for me if he started acting out and everything would get fine. But then he started getting a little bit too attached. He started saying he wouldn't do anything unless I was there at all times, which of course I couldn't be, since I was needed elsewhere. While I floated to different wards often, the secured unit was one of the ones I spent the least amount of time in. He started to get real mad, saying I needed to make more of an effort to see him and that I wasn't trying hard enough. I tried to explain to him that technically he was not even my patient, and I couldn't spend my entire work shift just hanging out with him, and that's when things started getting really bad. He started lashing out more, yelling and screaming at everyone. He was becoming violent with not only the staff, but other patients as well. He was a real liability. I had to drop something off in the security unit one day, and one of the other CNAs told me he had been asking for me. I popped my head in, and he started saying things like, "There's my girl." I felt uneasy, but remained calm on the outside. He was in a good mood, and I didn't want to be the one to set him off for everyone else. He gave me this big hug and kissed me, immediately making me feel queasy. I kind of laughed it off and got myself out of there as quickly as possible. After that, I avoided the secured unit at all costs. He started telling the other nurses he wanted only me to take care of him, and when they said it wasn't possible because that wasn't my ward, he started going to my bosses and the heads of the facility, trying to convince them to make me his caretaker. Luckily, my bosses had my back and told him there was no way I could be assigned back there due to my high demand in other areas. He didn't like hearing that. He started threatening everyone, saying they would be real sorry, and this wasn't the end of that, and so on. My boss called me into the office as soon as I walked into work the next day and explained that I wasn't allowed anywhere near that wing and to avoid all contact with this guy. Well, I surely had no problem with that. I went about my day. He would start banging on all the doors, demanding to be let out, and saying he needed to see me. My anxiety was through the roof. I even called out a few times because I didn't want to be anywhere near this guy. The facility was working fast to get him out of there because they had reason to believe I could possibly be in danger due to his escalating violent behavior. On top of all of that, it didn't help that some of the other staff members were whispering behind my back, saying I'd let this all happen, and I was always flirting with him, a bunch of other ugly things as well. Eventually, they did get him discharged, and I felt a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. Other than people still talking about me behind my back, of course, I felt like I could get back to doing my job properly. I didn't let the experience change the way I treated the rest of my patients with open arms and an open heart. Things started to get back to normal, or so I thought. One of my days off, I got a call from my coworker. She told me he had called the facility asking specifically for me. She told him I wasn't in for work that day, and he tried to get my schedule. I'd dealt with someone stalking me before, so I immediately started to shut down. She told me she had already informed our boss, and I should go to the heads of the facility when I came back to work the next day. That's what I did. I expressed my feelings and told them it made me nervous that he'd called for me. She told me it wasn't just the one time either. They were receiving phone calls non-stop from him, asking when I would be in, and that if they didn't tell him my schedule, he was going to go over there himself and find out one way or another. We had to take a plan of action in case he did show up. They even suggested changing me to a different shift time because he knew I worked mid-afternoon and evenings. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere by myself and had to be picked up and dropped off at work. While I waited for my ride, I had to wait inside the building and have someone escort me in and out. The calls continued, and finally they had to threaten legal action. They had a huge meeting with the entire staff of the facility. I felt humiliated, knowing all the whispers and snide comments would come flooding back, but luckily I got more support than hate. The calls started to slow down, and my true friends at work stood up for me when I wasn't there to defend myself. I started to get back into my routine once again and started feeling like my usual old perky self. One of my bosses called me into the office one day with a big smile on her face. "I don't think he'll be bothering you anymore. He's in jail for violating parole." I was over the moon. My nightmare was coming to an end. A month or so later-ish, this was a while ago, so I can't exactly remember how long, I was at work getting people ready for bed when suddenly everyone started talking and whispering like crazy. My phone was ringing off the hook, so I finally took a call from one of my charge nurses. She told me the guy had been killed in jail and to check out the article she'd just sent me. I learned he had an incredibly violent history, including child abuse, neglect, other unspeakable things, domestic abuse, robbery, many violent offenses. My boss asked how I was feeling. I told him I couldn't really say. I was a bit sad, but I wasn't surprised that his temper and his mouth had gotten him into some trouble. I've left that facility since then and moved on to bigger things. I sleep soundly at night, knowing someone like that can never bother anyone again. 2 years ago, my SO and I found the perfect place to rent. It was a small tract of fabricated homes. The neighborhood was nice. It was quiet, which for 2 college seniors wanting out of the noisy dorms was pretty much heaven. Now, because this was Arizona and it was prefab houses, most of the folks that lived in our neighborhood were 60 or older, save a few of them. To our left was Sandra and David, a really nice couple in their early 60s, both retired postal workers. They spent summers in Maine and winters here. To our right, Carol, a 40-something who supposedly owned her own home business. She looked like she was perpetually sucking on a lemon. She was just kind of off. At first, she would occasionally join my SO for a smoke on the porch, or if we barbecued with Dave or Sandy, we would invite her over. To say she was awkward would be putting it lightly. We suspected that maybe she was on the spectrum, perhaps. We would be eating, and then she would just randomly start describing how her mother died a slow, agonizing death. Or she would randomly begin explaining her latest yeast infection in great detail. I kid you not. Sometimes I would work out on our porch. I had a small bench with a bar and some weights. One day I was lifting, but I almost dropped the bar on my neck in surprise. Leaning over me was Carol. "You know, I could have snapped your neck like a twig if I wanted to," she mumbled. I sat up confused. "Pardon?" I asked. "I said you really could have hurt yourself," she said. I doubted what I'd heard, chalking it up to not hearing her correctly the first time, but she had this weird smirk on her face. After that, I tried my best to ignore her. However, I had not told my SO my suspicions that maybe old Carol here was a bit absolutely insane. I came home from class one evening, and my SO and Carol were on the porch. I went inside because I was coming down with something and just wanted to go to bed. My SO came in and told me she was going to her job. She worked nights as a dispatcher for the campus police. I was real out of it. She kissed me goodnight and said she'd lock up the house and see me in the morning. Around 1 a.m., I wake up covered in sweat. I went to go get a glass of water and started drinking it. That was when I looked over and saw my SO on the couch, or at least who I assumed to be my SO. I was so out of it I just crawled back into bed and fell asleep. The next morning I woke up. My SO walked in the door telling me that work last night had been real crazy. "Wait, what? You weren't at work, you were here." She looked at me funny, and I got a sick feeling in my gut. Fever or no fever, I knew someone had been sitting on that couch. My SO wrote it off as a fever dream. The house had been locked up when she left. I forgot about it, life went on, and graduation was approaching. Things with my side of the family, well, specifically my egg donor, went badly. Long story. My SO was offered a job back in her home state of New York, so we gave notice to our landlord. We let Sandy and Dave know, and one night we told Carol as well. She gave us this blank stare, then headed back to her house without saying a word. We just brushed it off as her being weird as usual. That night we were asleep when I heard a creaking coming from the living area. I sat up. My SO heard it too. She grabbed my arm, and I grabbed the metal bat under our bed. "Who's there?" I asked. The door thudded. Thank God it was locked. My SO dialed 911. Meanwhile, I was watching as someone attempted to recreate the door scene from The Shining. Except instead of a big axe, whoever was doing it was using a small hatchet. They were making progress on the door though, as it was pretty much hollow. The 6 minutes it took for police to get there felt like a lifetime. I could see each time the hatchet's tip breached through the door. Suddenly, we heard the cops tell someone to put their weapon down. I had no idea who it was until we were led out of our place. As we were leaving, there on the couch in cuffs was Carol. We learned after that she had been in and out of jail. Supposedly, she'd gone cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs after long-term meth use. She was arrested and charged with breaking and entering and destruction of property. They tried to get her on attempted assault, but she made a plea deal that included some kind of psychiatric treatment. I never could prove she was in my place the day I was sick, but I was sure it was her. As we were moving, I was messing around with our storage space, really a crawl space underneath the home. We had never used it. Curious, I crawled around underneath there and saw that if you kicked hard enough, you could get the screen that led to the outside off easily. Who knows how many times she might have been in our place or underneath our house listening to us. We still keep in touch with Sandy and Dave. The unit Carol rented was sold though, and they haven't seen her since she was carted off to jail. Thankfully, we're now thousands of miles away, and we'll never have to see her again. This happened yesterday, while both of my parents were at work. For context, my dad's a mailman, and my mom is an RV saleswoman that's always on her feet. Neither can pick up their phone very quickly. I do have an older brother, but he's at college 2 hours away, so he's not really an actor in this story. I was sitting in the living room with my dog, a fairly big German shepherd, but can't really do much harm. That was when I heard what sounded like people talking out in the hallway. This wasn't that unusual. I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment, and there's a really noisy family right next door that likes to bring over their friends a lot. This was also a Saturday, so it's not like I was expecting pure quiet or anything. I obviously just ignored the talking. It was not that loud, and I had my headphones on. All of a sudden, though, my dog perked up and walked toward the door with an alert posture. The hair on his back was sticking right up, which usually never happened. I got concerned and took my headphones out. That's when I heard the voices from before. I could now clearly recognize 2 adult men yelling very loudly in the apartment hallway. I got a bit freaked out, so I pushed my dog away from the door. I double-checked to make sure it was locked and crept towards it to peek out and make sure they weren't near my place. When I looked out the peephole, I couldn't see either of them, and because the only blind spot in my peephole is directly to the right, I knew these must be my neighbors. As I was leaning against it, the whole front door started shaking. The men were banging on the neighbor's door and still yelling things, calling them a shit-talking motherfucker. It's at this point I grabbed my dog and tried to pull him into my room while I tried to call my dad. Luckily, he picked up in just a few rings. He told me I should just stay in my room and be quiet, and they would go away all on their own. It'll become very obvious that my dad gives really bad advice. I did stay in my room for the most part, but I called my best friend just to have someone on the phone because my dad couldn't stay on. My room was the furthest from the door, so they definitely wouldn't have heard me whispering to my friend about the situation. After about 5 minutes, I didn't hear the banging anymore. I told my friend I was going to check and see if I could notice anything. When I got out of my room, I didn't hear any more sounds, so I got closer to the door. I looked out the peephole, and I could see one of them pacing. All I can remember is that he was bald, tall, and white. I freaked out again. I started creeping back to my room when I heard one of them say, "Maybe we got the wrong house." This threw me into a full-blown panic attack. My identical apartment door was 5 feet away from my neighbor's. All the others were right down the hallway. If they didn't know the exact number, and obviously weren't scared to bang an apartment door down midday, they would probably come to my door next. Again, I pulled my dog into my brother's room, since it had a lock, and camped out there. I waited for about 10 minutes before I heard the banging calm down again, and I couldn't hear any talking from my position. I was texting my friend who also lived in the complex what was happening. that it was finally stopping. That's when the banging started again, this time on my door. They went through the same routine, but this time they were much more aggressive. I could hear them slamming, kicking, and hitting my door, all while yelling for some guy I didn't know to come out. I later confirmed with my brother, and he told me there was no way he could have been involved with this, especially because he's 19 and those men had to have been at least 25. I called my dad again, and in his panic he told me to leave my room and tell them there were no guys in my apartment, that I'm just a girl all alone. I told him instead of that I was going to call 911. I knew they weren't just looking to break down a door. They were targeting some guy they thought did them dirty. I didn't want to go out there, even if they were looking for some guy. I didn't know if they had weapons, and in their enraged state, they might just call bullshit. Number 2, I was a high school freshman girl. I'm 5'4", 116 pounds, and quite frankly have zero fight in me. I would stand no chance against 2 adult men at my door, and even if that's not what they were there for originally, letting them know I was a teen girl home alone was not the best idea. I sat next to my locked bedroom door as I called 911 with my dog in tow, who I tried to keep quiet this whole time. During this situation, I made sure to try and be as quiet as possible. I'm pretty sure they didn't know anyone was home, even though they said, "We know you're in there," during their yelling. I was on the phone with 911 for a few minutes before I heard light knocking at my door. I was in such shock I didn't even know the banging had stopped. The operator said it was the cops, so I ended the call and answered the door. The officers told me the guys took off as they arrived. They asked me a few questions about family members who were male and if they could have any correlation with this, but it was discovered nobody did. It was a hot summer's day, and my mom took my siblings and I to play in a stream at a park where people often went for walks or fishing. It was very isolated though, and there was hardly ever many people around. My siblings and I were enjoying splashing in the water, and we even caught a few fish as well. Everything was going great, and we came here quite often. That was until off in the distance, we heard a twig break and noticed a group of men coming towards us. We thought they must have been going for a walk or maybe wanted to go fishing as well, so we didn't really pay that much attention to them. We continued what we were doing, but eventually they started coming closer to us. They also began to do this strange circling in pattern around us and just kept staring at us the whole time. My mom started to become quite worried, and us kids were confused as well. Why were they just staring? Now they seemed to be slowly coming closer as well. They all gave each other this unsettling look and then started to enclose and surround us. My mom grabbed us kids right away and told us to run. The 4 of us ran as fast as we could and managed to slip in between their encirclement. We got back to our car. I turned around to see what those men were doing, and they were all walking away in the same direction, staring at us in an eerie way. Once we got to the car, my mom sped away, and that's when I realized what was going on. Those guys probably wanted to do something bad to us, and since my dad wasn't there with us, it made us quite the easy targets. My mom, siblings, and I never went back there again. If we hadn't run away before they got any closer, I don't know what might have happened to us. I, now a 20-year-old woman, was 13 at the time this story takes place. It was the summer between 7th and 8th grade for me, which would make the year 2016. I had just moved to a new city about an hour away from where I grew up. To help me make friends before the school year started, my mom signed me up for a day camp in the new town over the summer. At this camp, I actually did develop a small friend group, but the only one that matters in this story would be Jay, a 14-year-old. I'm gonna be honest, Jay was always more flirty with me than I was comfortable with, and I'd expressed that several times. I always tried to minimalize confrontation when I did so. I guess hindsight is 20/20. I should have cut the friendship off when it was clear he wasn't respecting my boundaries. But damn, I was a lonely kid, and all my other new friends acted like this was completely normal. Well, one day, the rest of the friend group was not there. One was sick, and the other two were siblings whose family had taken a day trip. Jay and I were hanging out alone in the gym. We were sitting off to the side talking about something. The gym was full of other kids and counselors. That was when he said he had a secret to tell me and asked me to lean in closer. As soon as I did, he grabbed me and pushed me down to the ground. He held down my arms and got on top of me. In front of the whole gym, he began trying to kiss me, using the hand he wasn't holding me down with to fiddle with the buttons on my pants. I screamed at him to stop and to get off me. I thrashed around. I made it as difficult for him as possible to do what he was attempting to do, but he wouldn't stop. None of the counselors gave me a second look. I thought that in a room full of people, nobody was going to stop him, and I knew that if somebody didn't, he was going to easily overpower me and do whatever horrible things he wanted. I was still struggling with him on top of me when a group of 4 or 5 kids from the younger group who had been playing badminton saw what was going on. They decided to take things into their own hands since nobody was stepping up to help me. I want to stress to you guys, these kids were from the 6 to 9 age group. None of them looked older than 8 either, but these kids brought their rackets with them and rallied around me. I heard their chorus of voices screaming at him to get off of me. I even heard one prominent "she said no" ring out. I watched their rackets slide between our faces as they tried to pry him off of me. The other kids then took their rackets when he wouldn't stop and started going ham on him, beating the crap out of him. At first, he was so focused on me that he tried to swat at them and tried to hit the kids back, then continued trying to force himself on me. The combination of me thrashing and the kids hitting him was making this a lot harder than he thought it would be though. After 5 minutes of being beaten by these children, Jay decided it wasn't worth it anymore. He got off me and ran away. I still think about that a lot. It was traumatic as hell for me. Not only that a friend tried to do that to me, but that all the adults in the room that were supposed to protect me completely ignored what was going on. It's sick to think that those small kids cared more about me than any of the adults. At the same time, it gave me a little bit of hope for the future to know that the younger kids were being taught to care about others in that way. Those kids would now be at the same age I was when this happened. I wonder about how they're doing all the time. I wonder if they ever think about what they did for me that day. I hope they know how grateful I am. I can't say I'm glad this happened by any means, but in a way I'm grateful. It gave me a way to still have hope in the future, even if some people are bad. I'm a 25-year-old woman, and when my wife Julie and I were planning our wedding, we were immediately drawn to a Hawaiian honeymoon. The sun, the sand, the tropical resort and turquoise water, it all seemed so dreamy and perfect. We even planned our wedding around a beach on mainland US as a way of prepping for that bliss. It went really smoothly, and Julie and I were very happy, surrounded by our friends and family. Before we go into the honeymoon itself, here's a little backstory. I actually met Julie in a scuba diving tour of sorts. She offered to be my diving buddy, and we've been looking after each other ever since, really. When we found a few scuba diving tours near our honeymoon resort, we didn't hesitate to make a few reservations. That's how we found ourselves just off the southern coast of Molokai on a bright sunny day. The group consisted of our diving instructor, a couple of other young guys on vacation, Julie and I, and an older man. It was a fairly modest group, but sometimes those were more relaxed because there were less people for the diving instructor to keep track of. Together, we all went out to the appropriate depth, the only sound being the chatter between us and the roar of the boat as its engine revved. We all finished putting on our gear as the instructor went through his speeches about sticking to your diving buddy and not to resurface too quickly. All the standard safety stuff. Out of the blue, the older man on board turned to Julie and asked if she'd be his diving buddy. Julie looked at me confused and laughed uncomfortably. Actually, my wife and I already planned to go together, but you're welcome to join us if you want, I guess. The man's face suddenly twisted into a mask of anger. I could even see the tips of his ears turning bright red as he spoke. Well, it was more like just below yelling. "You're a slur? You shouldn't even be here." I immediately spoke up. "Well, what the hell is that supposed to mean?" He opened his mouth to reply, but the instructor interjected before he could say anything else. "Hey, I don't tolerate that kind of behavior on my dives. If you don't want to be taken back to shore, you better start behaving now, sir." We sighed, grateful for the help in de-escalating the situation, but we were also incredibly embarrassed that it happened in the first place. Even on our honeymoon, we'd somehow managed to find someone like that. While the man busied himself with getting ready, Julie and I checked each other over and told ourselves we were still going to have a fantastic dive and an even better honeymoon. The instructor gave the go-ahead, and altogether we flipped over backwards into the cool blue void. It had been quite a while since we'd been diving. I got a bit disoriented, but Julie grabbed my hand and I steadied myself. Though I couldn't see her face through the thick scuba gear, I could tell she would smile if her mouthpiece let her. I remember the water near the surface was a crisp blue expanse that never seemed to end. A familiar sensation of floating was taking over. Below us lay a reef. There's no other word to describe it but simply majestic. The coral sprawled onward like a big plant-like apartment complex, all different spectrums of colors. And speaking of colors, the sea life swimming around was just as much a rainbow. From the small fish picking at the coral all the way up to the small reef sharks stalking above them, the whole thing was just taking my breath away, and being there with my love made it all better. We swam next to each other for a while, exploring the area and seeing everything it had to offer. The rest of the group had split up to do their own thing. The two inexperienced guys were staying more near the surface, getting used to the feeling of being underwater, while the older man was presumably sticking close to the diving instructor, since he didn't appear to have a partner. I can't say I wasn't happy to not be near him. The further away he was, the better. I signaled to Julie I was going to check out some of the sharks a bit farther away. Not a big fan of that one, was she? I left her for a minute to do her own thing, while still making sure we were well within sight of each other, as per diving rules. I'd only be away from her for a second or two. Well, a second is all it took. I'd just about reached the area I wanted to explore when I felt something slam into me so hard it almost pushed my respirator out. I clenched my teeth to keep that thing in there and looked around. I thought I'd been hit by a shark being curious or something, but that quickly went out the window when a hand grabbed my arm from underneath me and tried to tug me down. I was nearly being flipped upside down, straining to get a look at what was happening. A person reached for my face, and with horror I realized they were trying to grab my mouthpiece. I couldn't scream, I couldn't think. I could only hang on for dear life with my teeth and pray this person couldn't pry it loose from my mouth. My breathing quickened. Bubbles swished by us, fizzing in the struggle. We were attracting attention from the nearby wildlife. 1 or 2 sharks even swam up against the person attacking me. They seemed startled by this and batted at the sharks, who carried on as if nothing were happening. Thankfully, that was my chance. I lashed out at the person as they were trying to deal with the wildlife, pushing myself away and trying to kick them with my flippers as I swam. Not exactly the most effective, but at least it was something. I immediately swam back to Julie and gestured that we needed to resurface right now. We made our way to the top of the water as quickly as we could, and all I could do was rip off my mask and hug her. We made our way back to the boat and had a chance to talk safely. When she heard that someone had tried to drown me under the water, her eyes darkened and she was more furious than I'd ever seen her. She immediately knew who it had to be, and on some level, so did I. That old man, the one who'd had a problem with us since we started this dive. I was in shock he tried to kill me over such a petty reason. That's just sick. We sat on the boat with the driver until it was time for the others to resurface, who were just as horrified as we were. When the man climbed back onto the boat, I felt my stomach drop. I hated the idea of sitting with him all the way back to dry land. When he pulled off his mask and saw me staring and Julie glaring, his eyes got really, really wide. Julie immediately went off on the guy, calling him a sick bastard for trying to kill her wife and screaming that he'd tried to kill me. The instructor got between us to try and sort out the situation, and when I gave my statement about him trying to pull out my breathing tube and holding me underwater, the instructor got out his phone and dialed the police. The 2 young guys held the man down as we quickly headed to shore, where the authorities were waiting to question me and seemingly arrest him. I know it sounds anticlimactic, but it all got settled out of court. He ended up being related to the head of the police force in some way. That in itself is terrifying, but it's even more terrifying he would think to just kill someone so casually for not aligning with his personal worldview. Julie and I didn't go scuba diving for the rest of our trip because we were worried something like that might happen again. Maybe we'll go out one day because you can't spend the rest of your life in fear, but we'll be much, much more vigilant